Hello everyone, welcome to our final presentation for historical period number 3. This is 4.3.2 and it's going to deal with the national expansion and shifting debates over slavery. So we're doing a whole presentation just on how slavery is changing, how it's expanding, and what is that effect within the United States, and how is the government going to respond to these changes over an institution that is already causing a lot of controversy and conflict within the United States as it develops. Alright, so first let's talk about what has been changing dealing with slavery since about 1790, so going all the way back to the early republic to see how slavery is growing and developing. Okay, first thing to know is that something that grew in this time period was the domestic slave trade. And slowly it starts to replace the international slave trade. Most countries around the world are getting rid of the international slave trade, which means that if you were an American looking to buy slaves, it was going to be easier to buy them from within the country as slavery grew organically there rather than from outside the country. Okay. We also see as the nation expands into the South with that land that was gained through the American Revolution, there are more slave states that develop down there. And this is where we have to shift from just calling it the South to having the Upper South and the Deep South. Upper South is Maryland and Virginia, that area. Places that had had slavery all the way since colonial times and profited from it. And then there's the Deep South. These are new states that are getting onto the Gulf of Mexico coast: Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. Now by the 1850s, a little bit beyond the focus of our period where we are right now, most slaves are in the Deep South. And you can see that from those two maps to the right. Those show the density of slave populations from 1790 to, I can't read that. Is it 1830? Yeah, I can't read it. I think it says 1830. But what you see is that those red parts have the highest densities, then yellow, then purple, then the light purple. And you can see the areas that were dense before are staying so, but new areas are opening up and becoming just as dense further south. Now, as slavery moved south, it was actually worse in the Deep South. A couple reasons for that. One had to do with the climate. So as you get further south, not quite in the tropics, but getting there, the climate is hotter, and that means days are longer, which led to a longer growing season, longer time that things could be cultivated, which means you could grow things like sugar, right? I think I said this back during the colonial presentations about Brazil specifically and the West Indies. Sugar can only grow in the very hottest, most humid conditions. We get down to Louisiana, Florida, and the Gulf Coast down there, and these conditions start to be there. And that was some of the conditions for cultivating sugar in terms of what it took. It was a very strenuous process, okay? When you get into the Upper South, cultivating things like tobacco, indigo, rice, even cotton aren't as bad as cultivating sugar. So slavery is expanding into the Deep South, but something that is not expanding into the Deep South is infrastructure from the market revolution. What the South did instead is they used their money in farming equipment because agriculture is what was being successful for their economy at the time. And it was so profitable in the short term that they were not thinking of the long term. Short term is what's happening right then. Long term is where are we going to be in 10 to 20 years. They weren't thinking that. They were saying, this is so profitable and it will always be so. Why would we bother worrying about infrastructure or internal improvements? So that's how slavery is changing as a system. What was the impact on African Americans with this? Now, as slavery grows, the white sort of the hierarchy that controls African Americans felt the need to make things stricter. So slave codes were created in many of these states to regulate the behavior of slaves, but also of free blacks as well. Okay? It became illegal for blacks to own property, receive an education, travel at night. If you can limit what their behavior is, you can limit them to what they can do in life, which would be work on the plantation, never be able to move outside that system. Now, another impact, a very negative impact, was that the system tore apart families, especially with the domestic slave trade. The idea that suddenly people were not just property to work on these plantations, but they were a commodity to be traded, meant that as these areas opened in the South, it became profitable to sell slaves from the upper South into the lower South, or what am I saying? Deep South. And this was called being sold down the river. So American society still uses this term sold down the river colloquially to mean being betrayed. Well, this is where it got started. You were literally being sold down the Mississippi River, or the Missouri River, the Ohio River, down into the Deep South where conditions were much worse. So let's look at some data. 25% of black marriages were broken up as a result, and 1/3 of all children who were slaves were taken away from their families. It's within this era where we see many runaway slaves were often just trying to reunite with their families. Even if they weren't trying to get to freedom in the North where slavery was illegal, they were just trying to get back to what they wanted, their families, whom they had been taken away from. All right, so what we're going to look at now is how the abolitionist movement was increasing and what was going on in the South with the points of view on slavery as well. So I've mentioned abolitionism before. It was kind of in this very, nascent state earlier on. Okay, and that's because the North is getting rid of slavery. They feel like they don't need it because their economy doesn't require it, which meant that certain elements said, well, if we don't need it, if the world doesn't need it, then perhaps it's immoral as well, moving into the idea it should be abolished entirely. Now, as the North and the Midwest, and later the West, move away from slavery, the abolitionism movement grows. Let me give you some proper noun details to go along with this. So, one of the most prominent abolitionists, so later on than William Lloyd Garrison, we have Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass was a former slave from Maryland who escaped to freedom by heading north. The way he became famous is he wrote an autobiography of his life, and it detailed just how horrible the conditions were, the psychological and the physical abuse put upon slaves, and it also details kind of this sort of epiphany he had while he was working, where he realized how bad it was and how he needed to just get out of there. Now what happens, he was self-taught to read, to write, to be an eloquent orator and speaker. So once he becomes a prominent abolitionist, he is going to promote the cause all across the North and the Midwest through speaking tours. Okay, he does this all the way through the Civil War and beyond, and he's going to inspire others to do this as well as a method for sort of propagating the abolitionist points of view by revealing to the people its horrors and hoping they will then participate in a similar way. Another element of this growing abolitionism was the Underground Railroad. They rescued about 1,000 slaves per year, smuggling them more or less out of the South into the North and often into Canada, where slavery was now illegal. So there was no actual railroad, no tracks, no choo-choos. It was just a system of safe houses, and they would use the terminology of railroads to conduct business. So people like Harriet Tubman, who would conduct the runaway slaves from place to place, were called conductors, okay? They would call these safe houses stations, okay? It was kind of code names so people wouldn't really know what they're talking about. This operates from, I think, around like the 1830s all the way into the 1850s. Of course, once we get past the Civil War, slavery's gone, so is the railroad. But I feel like in modern times, this has been very mythicized and sort of blown out of proportion. It was around, it was significant, but there's a lot of mythology that goes along with it as well. So, this is another point that I like to bring up. So we see abolitionism growing, trying to abolish slavery, but that does not mean that racism wasn't there. And this is what we see through minstrel shows. And minstrel shows were not as common in the South as they were in northern cities. Basically, the form of entertainment back then were stage shows in which white people would put on blackface and basically perform these stereotypes as characters of black people. So ask me questions about this in class, and I'll give you some details about what these kind of stereotypes were, what they meant, and how they reinforce this racial hierarchy. What it kind of shows is that people get their views from entertainment, from what they consume in media. And if media is presenting that these type of racial stereotypes are perfectly okay and they're funny, that means it's going to sort of seep into northern society that may say, we don't want slavery around, but we still want to laugh at black people. Okay, so that's what's going on in the north. Let's look at what's going on in the south now regarding slavery and points of view on it. So, 75% of southern whites did not own slaves. Remember, it's those plantation elites, very select people who controlled the society. Okay, so the reason this happened is those same people, the plantation elite, had controlled power in the system for so long that there weren't a lot of possibilities for social mobility in the South. There was not education, so you could not learn how to do something and make it into the middle class. You were beholden up to the elite who ran the system. So what did these southern whites do if they didn't own slaves? They were small farmers. They might have been sharecroppers, so renting land from large plantation owners, paying their rent in what they grew, most of it, a large percentage of it. And many were laboring poor as well, so just working on farms, not even having their own land to work. Many others worked as plantation overseers. So they basically did the dirty work of the plantation. So it would be their job to be in the fields, watching the slaves, making sure that they were working hard and working fast, and the pay for these overseers was based on the crop output of the slaves they oversaw. So it was in their interest to be harsh on the slaves and to make sure they worked as efficiently as possible so the overseers could get more money. Okay, you can see how this works. They could not be involved because there was no power left to go around. It was in the hands of the elite. But if you got to hold the whip in the fields, you felt like you were a part of the system. And it made many poor whites feel like plantation society was also their society. And what it did is it united whites in the South together based on race rather than uniting disparate groups based on social status. It was not in the interest of the elite to have the poor whites in the South and the slaves in the South realize that despite this demarcation of being a slave or being free, they were both on the bottommost rung of society, very poor with no chance of getting ahead. Using race as a construct for getting sort of this element of power felt by poor whites despite not really having it, united the South under white supremacy, and in the process kept slavery as such a strong system that people of any class would have supported because it was tied to race in the process. All right, our last slide. We've looked at slavery, how it's spreading, how it's changing, what perspectives on slavery are at this point. And despite all these possible changes and points of view, basically, it was still a controversial issue that the government had to figure out how are we going to keep this from erupting into a national problem, because slavery is spreading, right? And we have sides that support it and we have sides that oppose it. And they had to find a compromise, a middle ground to keep both sides at bay. Here's what they are. What did the government do? First of all, if you go back to the Constitution, it said that there could be no discussion of ending the international slave trade until 1808. But guess what? In that time period from 1788 to 1808, the domestic slave trade had been picked up. So when 1808 came around, the international slave trade was outlawed almost immediately because it didn't matter. There were so many slaves to be traded domestically that there wasn't a need to bring more from Africa. So even the South wasn't really opposing this because they knew it wasn't an issue realistically. Let's look at some numbers here, by the way, that shows you just how big the domestic slave trade was. 10 million Africans were brought to America over that almost a 350-year period there. Only about 400,000 went to North America. Okay? Now, 1.2 million were traded after the international slave trade was abolished. So what we're seeing here is it's still a very large amount involved in the domestic slave trade. If only about 400,000 over 300 years came to North America, but 1.2 million were traded from about 1808 to 1865, that shows you the huge difference just in terms of the number of years and the number traded. Slavery was not slowing down, it was only growing because of the expansion into southern territory that was good for growing things, where the landowners wanted free labor through the use of slavery. Okay, an absolutely critical thing you need to know beyond all doubt is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Okay, let me give you some details and then I'll tell you why it's so significant. So, states are joining all throughout this era, and what often happened is the government would find a way to delay the entrance of a new state until two states wanted to join. So, one free state would come in and one slave state would come in. It would keep the balance in the U.S. Senate, and there would be no controversy over which had more power in the federal government. Problem came along. Oops, I already put it there, I'm sorry. Missouri wanted to enter as a slave state, and that would offset the balance. So they had to find a way to allow Missouri to join. It was sort of the constitutional right that it could do so once it had enough people, but they needed to appease the North that was turning anti-slavery. Well, what was decided is that the state of Maine would join as a free state, breaking away from Massachusetts. So that territory that is today Maine, it kind of looks like a hand, used to be just part of Massachusetts all the way back since the New England colonial era. So that was one side of it. Here was the compromise they made. Missouri, slave state, Maine, free state, but they had to deal with, well, how is the spread of slavery going to happen after this issue? So what they set was this line of latitude, 36 degrees and 30 minutes, that established the northern boundary of future slave states. Now, this line is Missouri's southern border. So what that means is Missouri would be the last state allowed to have slaves above the 36-30 line. Now, at the time, this seemed like an okay deal. Slavery was spreading and growing, and we had the Louisiana Purchase, where free states could grow, but there was still some space for slave states to grow as well. We didn't foresee national expansion beyond this at this point. Keep that in mind at this point. So, both sides agreed to it, and it is going to be the rule on the expansion of slavery for the next 30 years. It basically appeases both sides for a very long time until we get new land and the argument comes back up in a much more drastic way than before. Okay, so it's so important because it's a long-lasting agreement that lets slavery continue the same process without a lot of debate. Another thing that prevented the debate over slavery, especially getting rid of it or changing it, was something called the gag rule. So this was a rule in the House of Representatives, and one of the reasons that exists is the House of Representatives is the lower house of Congress, has a lot more strict rules that regulate who can talk when and what's going on. Okay, so it existed in various forms for this time period here. Essentially what it did is if a congressperson, congressman at the time, no women were in Congress, if a congressman came in and submitted a bill for discussion about abolishing slavery or altering the rules, someone who was pro-slavery would say, I move that this discussion should be tabled for a further time. Someone would second it, it would get tabled, and then it would never get discussed again. If someone tried to bring it back up, someone would simply come up and say, I move that we table this for later discussion. It kept on being put off, so they never had to talk about it. Now, John Quincy Adams, our sixth president, actually served in Congress after he was president, the only president to do something like that. He worked to change the rules in the House so this couldn't happen anymore. So that's why 1844 is really when it ends. John Quincy Adams was a fervent abolitionist and anti-slavery person. So that means why he said we can't prevent this discussion if people want to discuss it. So John Quincy Adams, since we're at the very end, I'll just tell you, he actually has an interesting story. So he continued to serve in Congress for Massachusetts after he was president, still had the same reputation for being kind of grumpy, just a grumpy old man. But he actually died on the floor of the House of Representatives. He was just sitting at his desk, working away. He was a very hard worker. And I can't remember if it was a stroke, heart attack. It was something along those lines where he just kind of cried out, fell over, and he died while he was at work. So basically working hard till the very end. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching. You know what your next steps are, or at least you should know by now. working on your terms, getting that quiz done by tomorrow, work on your geography, study your chronology, or get ahead on the next video if you so wish. So, this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you in class. Bye.